Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a brown bear in acrylics. Now this tutorial is going to focus on two main things. One, the layering and how to paint realistic fur, and the second is how to adjust the colour of that fur in our paintings. Now before I get into any part of the fur, I do like to paint the eye first. This is where the emotion and that expression stems from, so I like to make sure that I've got that done before I look at anything else. So let's jump into the fur section. Now you can see here with my base foundation there is not any colour really. I've got a little bit of brown with my dark mixture, but you could paint this all in grayscale and then add your colour with glazes later on. Now I like to work with glazes and adjust my colour throughout my stages, and you're going to see this in this tutorial. But here I want to be working with the fur that's closest to the skin and building up from there. So once I started putting in that little bit of fur texture, you saw there that I was putting a little bit of a brown colour over the top. I'm going to go back in with my liner brush and add in more fur, and I'm going to repeat that process. You can do this as much as you want until you've got the texture of the fur, the depth of the fur and the colour right. So all of this by working in separate layers means that no one part of that reference photo in the painting becomes overwhelming, and this is why I like to work in small sections. And something else that I will always do when working with acrylics is while I'm waiting for one area to dry, I'll start working on the next. So I'll either tweak the eye, add in some more highlights, adjust my colour, and then I can start on the next section, and that's what I'm doing here. And as I get more of the fur painted in, look at how soft this very first base layer is. And this I feel is really important. In all of my tutorials on Patreon, they're in real time, no parts sped up or cut out. I do focus on getting my base foundation looking soft and blended. How much blended and how soft it is going to be dependent on the fur texture. But because the bear here had a bit more of a softer fur texture, I made sure that that first base foundation had no harsh edges. If you have harsh start and stop points, it's going to be more difficult to get that fur looking soft. So I do feel that all of this texture, it is achieved right from that very first layer. And when I start to build up the fur, I am really just following the same layering process. So I'm now working with my nice fine but small liner brush. I do prefer these sorts of brushes at this sort of level. The longer liner brushes I like to use for some whiskers and things like that, but these finer brushes I feel get a little bit more of that detail, especially with this sort of fur texture. And look at how I'm now reapplying more colour, and this is all through the use of glazes. Now glazes is something that I get asked quite a lot about here on YouTube, and I don't use any glazing medium. I just thin my paints with water and I apply that as a glaze. And this is a really great way of working. It really does take that stress away from worrying about the exact colour at each stage. We do not have to worry about that at all. And as I work on this larger area on the top of the head, just look at how smooth and soft this foundation is becoming. And because I'm working here with multiple brushes, I'm allowing that paint to not really dry. So I'm getting that smooth transition from one colour to the next by doing wet on wet blending. Now if all of this is something you would like to see in depth with a voiceover while I'm painting, this tutorial is available on my Patreon now from start to finish. As I said, no parts cut out, it's not sped up at all. I've got a full colour list there, you've got the reference photo and liner. It's a really good one to follow along to. And as I say, because it does focus on the colour selection process, I've got a palette camera in the corner. You can see exactly what colours I'm mixing at the time. It really is great for anyone who's advanced in art or a beginner. It focuses on every single technique. So there are going to be many times throughout this tutorial where you probably think, well, that colour, it looks really faded, and that's okay at this stage because all I'm focusing on is my values and my contrast, so how dark or how light the fur is in that area, and my fur direction. Those two things are my main concern. I can focus on the colour later on. And that's what I'm going to do now. So here, again, I've just mixed my paint, thinned it down with water. But when you're working with glazes, it's really important to make sure that the layer underneath your detailed layers have completely dried. If that paint is still wet, when you go and apply the glaze on top, because it is obviously wet and it's significantly thinner, you will lift up that paint potentially, and then you're going to just create a real muddy mess. So you do want to make sure that when you're working with glazes, the layers underneath are completely dry. If you feel that there's any tackiness to that painting, you need to wait for it to dry even longer. Now with acrylics, that won't take long. You just want to leave it a couple of minutes, but you do just want to make that, I can't stress that enough, that's super important. Now if you are working with glazes and it completely hides your details, that means that your glaze is too thick. So you need to add a little bit more water or glaze in medium if that's your preference. If, however, the mixture is too thin, and you'll notice it starts to bead up and it lifts on that and sits on top of those layers, that there is too much water in your glaze mixture. So it is about finding the right balance, but once you've got that, it's very easy and simple. You'll notice that the more you practice with glazes. So now I've put a little bit more of this colour in place, I'm going to now start to work on another area of the fur. Now what I can't stress enough at this stage is everything I've painted so far is not finished. I'm only really at my mid layer. I've got lots of those finer details left to add. Now I always talk about the importance of contrast. I've already mentioned it a few times in this tutorial, but one thing that I often see is that sometimes we jump into our brightest highlights too early on. So when we look at that reference photo, we will notice the brightest hairs first usually, and that's okay, but we need to remember to leave those until the very last layers. Try to imagine it that hair is sitting on the very top. If you were to touch this bear, that hair is what you would touch first. So we want to be leaving that until the last layer so that it looks like it is sitting on top. Now with this layering process and the contrast, I'm really focusing on building up my highlights, but the only way that I'm able to achieve that is by having a darker base layer. If you're working through your process here and you feel that the fur is flatter, but you feel like your lighter layers are okay, that they are bright enough, but it's still not having that impact, it will usually be because the base layer that you started with was not dark enough in the first place. And you can see from the finished painting in the corner there how I wanted to create the effect of it looking like this bear is walking out from the shadows, almost like it's emerging from its den. So I really did want to make sure that my darks were really dark. So on to the next part here. So this was a brand new painting day for me. I started working on the nose, and what I have done here is on the Patreon version I've shown you a couple of other photographs of bears with the light source more on the nose. Because in this reference photo I was working from, the nose was really dark. You couldn't see much shape to it at all. And in my painting, although I didn't want to change the light source because that was really important, I don't want to add random highlights where they shouldn't be, but I did want to add a little bit more definition to the nostrils and a little bit more structure to the bottom of the nose. So when I'm working from a photograph where either the lighting isn't hitting it or maybe it's a poor quality photo, which wasn't the case for this, the photo is stunning, but if I'm working on a pet portrait and the details are lacking, it's a low quality photo, I will go to a royalty-free site somewhere like Pixabay and I'll find a photograph of that animal, that specific breed of dog for instance, in the same sort of pose, and I will then use the details from that and incorporate it into my painting. So my version has more details than the original reference photo that I'm working from. So onto the bridge of the nose. Now this is an area where when I was first new to doing pet portraits, I always got the fur direction wrong. I either made it far too upright and my brush strokes were more vertical, or I overcompensated and made them far too flat and horizontal. Now what that does is it either makes the bridge of the nose look really long or really wide. So this is one area where I want to make sure that I get that fur direction and the length of my brush strokes right. It's so important. And I have a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for painting realistic fur. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But there I do speak about those three main brush techniques. So fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. So look at how as I'm working on the area up to the eye, it sort of curves over the left hand side, but in between the two eyes it goes more upright. That area between those two sections, it shouldn't just start and stop. We want to be making sure that we're gradually curving and adjusting the way that that brush is moving in order to build up the three-dimensional shape of the bridge of the nose. Only when I've got the fur direction accurate and I'm happy with it do I then focus on my glazing and then rebuilding my layers and building up the depth. If I work with that first layer and I know my fur direction isn't right, and I then carry on building layers thinking, oh, I'll fix that later, it never works like that. I always want to make sure with any section that I'm working on that the first layer of detail and the fur direction is correct, because otherwise it's really hard to correct it without having to paint over it later on, and obviously that just wastes so much time. So my biggest tip when we're painting fur with that first layer of detail is do make sure that that fur direction is accurate. And because I knew that it was, now I can start building up my contrast, reinforcing those values. Now the length of the brushstrokes is also again really important. So if I were to be making my brushstrokes on the bridge of the nose as long as the brushstrokes for the fur on the top of the head, I'm going to make the nose look really fluffy. Now for some animals that would work well, but for this the fur on the bridge of the nose was significantly shorter, so I had to make sure that I reduced the length of those brushstrokes. So when it came to this side of the body and the ear here, this was really interesting, and if blending acrylics is something that you find quite challenging, the real-time Patreon version might be of interest, because I really do focus on a very simple and easy blending technique. Now previously for this sort of effect I would be using a fine mist sprayer bottle, but I do find that when I'm trying to still maintain some definition with the clumps of fur and I don't want it to be completely blended like a really soft background, I do find that using a fine mist sprayer bottle can be a little bit frustrating. It's very easy to add too much water to the surface, you end up then over blending, and that is a real problem. You can end up with the water running down your surface, and that then needs to be sorted before you can carry on blending. It can just cause a few other issues. Now this blending technique I'm using, because I was experimenting with it on this painting, it's definitely one that's going to be so much easier to practice and understand in that real-time version. But what I'm doing here is by making sure that I don't allow that paint to dry, I'm able to then use my blending brushes to really soften the edges but not over blend. And I know I've said that already a couple of times, but that's so important. I wanted this fur to still look like fur, but I wanted it to be slightly out of focus with those softer edges. So in most cases here, when you're using your blending brush, you only want to move that back and forth once or twice. If you do it any more than that, you're going to over soften the edges and it'll be completely blended. You'll end up with something looking like a bokeh effect, which obviously we don't want for this. There still has to be definition in the fur. Now I had to work on that soft out of focus part because the details on the side of the face here are overlapping and they're sat on top. Now another thing I talk about in my YouTube tutorials is the importance of order of your layers. So what I mentioned about the fur at the back and the face at the front, this is going to help to build up the three-dimensional look of this painting. If I hadn't have overlapped the fur on the edge of the face on top of that body that's out of focus, I would have everything looking at the same level. So by overlapping the details on the face, I've brought that section forward. And the more that we do this with extra additional parts of the painting, like when we work on the little hairs on the muzzle, that nose is then going to come further in front and closer to the viewer, and that will also help to push that soft out of focus fur on the side further back. So in the view there, I did just show a little tube of the blue Winsor & Newton. Now I actually like to use Liquitex Basics. I only bought that colour of the Winsor & Newton because I couldn't get any of the ultramarine blue in the Liquitex Basics at the time. I haven't noticed a difference between those two colours and it does work really well. I've mixed it with my Liquitex Basics without any problems, but the paint that I do like to use is Liquitex Basics. Now for some people they're a little bit too transparent, but because I like working with glazes and adjusting my colour throughout my layering process with the use of glazes, the Liquitex Basics are really well matched for this technique. So that is why I like to use those paints. And a bonus is they're really great quality for the price. They're at the lower end compared to other brands. That doesn't reflect on the quality of the paint. I can't stress it enough. They're really nice to work with. Now one thing that I would really like to talk about here is sometimes you'll read online that acrylics look like they've faded as soon as they've dried. Now you can sort of see that here at the top of the painting where we started working on the fur around the eye and on the top of the head. That there doesn't look as dark as the background on the left, the little dark section here by the finished photo in the corner. The only difference is Liquitex Basics dries with a matte finish. By the time I put a gloss varnish over this, once it's done, that there is going to make that paint look how it did when it was wet. So you can see here I'm applying that dark colour. That's exactly how dark it will look when it's got that varnish applied. So it's not that the paint has sort of faded, it's just that it's dried. That's the only thing there. And I do show on Patreon a little technique that you can use to check what your painting would look like if it was varnished. All you have to do is wait for that painting to completely dry and apply a layer of water over the top. So you can use a fine mist sprayer bottle. I just prefer using a larger paintbrush with some water on. Put that water across the top and you will then get to see how that painting looks when varnished. If at that stage you feel, actually, do you know what, that's not as dark as what I would like, or that colour's not as vibrant as I would like, that's when you can wait for that layer of water to dry and go back and make changes. So you really then don't have to have that worry that, oh, well, if I varnish it and there's things I wanted to have changed but now I can't, that water over the top is a really good technique to use. And actually in a few seconds you're going to see that I do that exactly at this point of the painting. But one thing here is notice how spaced apart my highlights are. This side of the face is in shadow, so I do not want to add too many highlights here because I will be adjusting the light source. This is where I'm applying that water. Look how vibrant my colours are. The darks go really dark, my highlights go really bright, but that colour is really standing out. Just by applying that layer of water over the top, you're going to be able to have a really good idea of what that looks like when varnished. A painting can look completely different once varnished. So sometimes here with this specific project, it might look like now the bear looks really muted and faded. It's not going to when it's varnished. It's so important. Now something else as well that I talk about in all tutorials is the importance of a light source. Now the main light source on this instance was coming from the right hand side, and you can really see that because my highlights are more focused there and the vibrant colours are more on that side of my painting. As I started working on the fur and the ear here, it is meant to be in shadow and you'll see that I'm using more of my cooler colours to represent that. So when I'm working on this section, I was using more purples, a little bit of that blue in with that fur, whereas on the other side of the face, I was using far more of my burnt sienna and raw sienna colours. So having this difference with warm colour versus cool colour is going to help to reinforce that light source. Now one thing as well, look at how in both ears, the centre section of those ears, there are no details at all. I've left them at my darkest colour. Because of the way that the light source is from the side and slightly behind, this is not able to catch any details on the inner part of the ear. So if I were to add details there, I would make it look like that light source is more directed face on, and that would completely change the feel and effect that I was going for with this piece. Now at this stage of the painting, this is where I would take a step back and I would think, is there anything that I need to change? Do I need to reinforce my highlights? Are there any parts of my shadows that need to be made darker? And this is also where, once that painting is dry, I will apply my final glazes to get that colour exactly where I want. And again, I will then make sure that I do the test with the water over the top to make sure that both of those things are accurate. So I really do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I do upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. Here is a photo of my finished painting. You can see here contrast and colour has been my main focus from start to finish, and if you would like to paint along to this in the real-time version, then that is available now on Patreon. I have a Patreon library on my website which lists every single one of my tutorials that are available on Patreon in all the mediums that I offer there, so you get an idea of the sort of content that's available before you sign up. Now the wonderful thing about Patreon is you can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time. It's really flexible. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And as always, thank you so much for watching.